Search through the entirety of Scripture, and you will never discover a solitary figure God raised to extraordinary heights who skipped a very specific, recurring sequence of trials. Absolutely zero exceptions exist. Whether you look at Moses, Ruth, Paul, David, Esther, or Joseph, every leader entrusted with massive kingdom influence walked the exact same gauntlet beforehand. Despite spanning varying eras, unique cultures, and wildly different divine assignments, the formula remains flawlessly consistent. Once this pattern clicks in your mind, two realities shift. First, you will spot this sequence everywhere in the biblical text. Second, you will suddenly possess the clarity to pinpoint your exact location within your own spiritual journey. Because here's the profound truth society ignores. The agonizing phase you're currently surviving is not a random accident, nor is it a divine penalty. It is rigorous, calculated preparation, and you are likely much closer to the finish line than you realize. But before we break down this universal sequence, you must grasp one unshakable foundational truth. If you miss this, everything else will just sound like empty motivational chatter. Here it is. God does not promote humans, He promotes character. The title or position is merely a vessel. What the Creator is actually accomplishing inside your deepest delays, hardest tests, and darkest seasons is forging a psychological and spiritual architecture strong enough to withstand the immense gravity of the blessing He is preparing to hand you. Handing massive authority to an unprepared soul is a tragedy. It either shatters them completely or rots them from the inside out. The Almighty cares for you far too deeply to allow either outcome. Consider King Saul, the ultimate tragic warning. He was handed the crown before his internal foundation was poured. On paper, he possessed the perfect resume, the height, the charisma, the royal seat, the spiritual anointing, but his internal world was far too fragile for his external reality, leading to a catastrophic and highly public ruin. The Creator witnessed that disaster and essentially declared, "Never again." Not with David, not with Joseph, and definitely not with you. Therefore, the phases we are about to explore are not evidence of a cruel deity, but rather the meticulous care of a father entirely committed to using you profoundly. Phase 1 always involves granting you a fleeting vision of your destiny long before granting you the keys to walk into it. The journey rarely kicks off with the actual promotion. It launches with a trailer of coming attractions. Look at Joseph, merely 17 when the divine visions began. He experienced two vivid dreams. One showed his brother's grain sheaves bowing to his own upright stalk. The next depicted the celestial bodies, the sun, moon, and 11 stars yielding to him in submission. This enraged his siblings and deeply unsettled his father, yet the prophecies were completely authentic. Immediately following this, Joseph was plunged into 13 brutal years of human trafficking and wrongful imprisonment, arriving at the furthest possible coordinate from that glorious promise. Yet the crucial detail often overlooked is that the vision did not arrive after the trauma, it preceded it. The Almighty revealed the final destination prior to marching him down the treacherous path required to reach it. This is a locked-in pattern. Abraham saw the promised real estate long before his feet ever touched the soil. Moses encountered the burning bush and received his liberation mandate prior to 4 decades of desert isolation. David was covered in prophetic oil by Samuel, officially marked as royalty while still smelling like livestock in a shepherd's field. This initial preview typically manifests in one of 3 distinct ways. It might be a literal, unmistakable dream. It could be a relentless, heavy pull toward a specific calling that you simply cannot ignore. Or it might surface as a raw talent operating at a frequency far above your current pay grade, a persistent internal compass needle aggressively pointing toward a larger horizon. This glimpse accomplishes 2 vital missions. First, it provides an anchor. When the environment turns hostile, and it absolutely will, you possess a tangible promise to grip when everything else disintegrates. Joseph survived the dungeon precisely because he held onto that nighttime revelation. Second, it serves as an audit of your heart's current condition. How do you react when the curtain is pulled back on your future? Do you puff up with arrogance like the teenage Joseph foolishly broadcasting his superiority to his brothers? Or do you embrace it with quiet humility, actively surrendering to the Creator's timeline rather than forcing your own? Countless individuals waste decades demanding God reveal their life's purpose, but if we are brutally honest, He has likely been whispering it to you for years. The real issue is how you behave in the waiting room. Phase 2 is where the Almighty systematically dismantles every single crutch you lean on that isn't Him. This is the crucible that shatters most people because it feels identical to sheer destruction rather than divine preparation. Nebuchadnezzar stands as history's most terrifying case study regarding this principle. As the undisputed sovereign of the ancient globe, he constructed Babylon, a literal wonder of the world, and dominated countless nations, wielding unparalleled earthly authority. Yet the Creator sent a prophetic warning via a dream. Humble yourself or lose absolutely everything. The prophet Daniel pleaded with him to change his ways, granting him a 12-month grace period. Exactly 1 year later, the arrogant monarch stood atop his palatial roof, basking in his own glory, boasting that he alone forged this magnificent empire by his own muscle, and for his own fame. Before the sentence even left his lips, the heavens struck. The king's mind fractured. He was banished to the wild, living among beasts for 7 grueling years. His hair matted into eagle-like feathers, his nails curled into talons, and the globe's supreme ruler literally grazed on grass. Finally, as the 7th year concluded, he simply shifted his gaze upward. That was the turning point. The split second he stopped obsessing over his own reflection and acknowledged the divine, his sanity, his throne, and his dignity were instantly reinstalled. In fact, his subsequent reign was even more spectacular. But grasp what was mandatory beforehand. The brutal stripping, the absolute eradication of every metric he used to measure his self-worth. His sanity, his castle, and his pride evaporated because he had anchored his identity in those transient things rather than the eternal. God, exercising severe mercy, demolished the false idols so the king could discover the only source of true power. Your personal experience with this phase will likely be less theatrical. You probably won't lose your mind and eat shrubbery, but the spiritual mechanics remain identical. God heavily relies on the mathematics of subtraction before engaging in addition. He will orchestrate the loss of the career that falsely defines you before revealing your genuine vocation. He will shatter the toxic relationship you use as a shield before exposing what you were actually designed to accomplish. He will disrupt your meticulously crafted 5-year plan, the one built entirely around your ego and convenience, and replace it with a deafening quiet that forces you to finally ask him for his blueprint. The Apostle Paul lived this reality. Though not mirroring the Babylonian king's madness, he intimately knew the process of reduction. He declared in his letter to the Philippians that he had actually learned to be completely content in every possible scenario. Notice the past tense. This was a highly acquired skill, born from enduring circumstances that forcefully separated him from his own self-reliance. Ask yourself this diagnostic question right now. Is there a specific element in your world that the Creator seems determined to pry from your fingers, yet you keep fighting tooth and nail to retain it? Is it conceivable that the very object you are violently clutching is the exact obstacle blocking your next season? This subtraction is not a penalty, it is spiritual surgery, and operating tables are never comfortable. Phase 3 introduces the quietest, most invisible, and arguably most critical test of the entire sequence. Your dedication to obscure, seemingly insignificant tasks when absolutely no one is applauding. Christ stated this with brutal clarity in Luke chapter 16. The one who is deeply trustworthy with pennies will be trustworthy with millions, and the one who cuts corners in the dark will embezzle in the light. This is far beyond a cute leadership quote. This is the literal algorithm God uses to calculate promotion. Joseph's tenure in Potiphar's estate perfectly illustrates this metric. He was not a paid intern or an ambitious executive. He was human property. He possessed 0 legal rights, no union rep, no HR department, and absolutely no upward mobility. Despite this, the text notes that the Almighty was with him, rendering him wildly successful. He executed the menial, degrading chores of a captive with such blinding excellence that his master surrendered control of the entire estate to him. Then arrived the ultimate blind spot test. Potiphar's wife threw herself at him relentlessly. Here was an isolated man in a foreign territory, utterly detached from his family's accountability, possessing no local reputation to ruin. Yielding would have been the easiest, most logical physical release. Instead, he bolted, literally leaving his jacket in her hands, sprinting away from temptation. His reward for that pristine, undocumented integrity? A one-way ticket to a dungeon. Observe carefully what the Creator did not do. He did not immediately issue a public reward for private obedience. Instead, he pushed Joseph further into the abyss. Yet, he also refused to abandon him. When the geopolitical crisis eventually hit Pharaoh's nightmares a full 2 years after the royal cupbearer conveniently forgot Joseph existed, the young Hebrew was perfectly positioned. His internal infrastructure had been forged in pitch-black obscurity. When he finally stepped onto the royal marble before the Egyptian monarch, there were no hidden skeletons to derail his destiny. Before facing the giant Goliath in front of 2 armies, David spent lonely, unglamorous years defending sheep. During that invisible season, he slaughtered both a lion and a bear with 0 spectators, 0 fanfare, and 0 journalists. Those victories didn't even make the official record until David himself cited them as his credentials to fight the Philistine champion. He was ruthlessly faithful when the stands were empty. Jesus himself spent 3 decades living as an unremarkable carpenter in a punchline of a village before launching a 3-year public campaign. Think about that ratio. The sovereign of the universe refused to place his own son on a global stage until he had successfully navigated 30 years of quiet, mundane, working-class faithfulness. This brings the spotlight directly onto your current reality, those unseen ethical dilemmas you navigate daily, your diligence in that dead-end job that feels miles beneath your potential, the grace you extend to people who can do absolutely nothing for your career. None of this is a waste of time. This is the actual training ground. Your public breakthrough will only rise as high as your private integrity can support it. The Almighty never shortcuts the shadows to reach the spotlight. The public platform is always poured over the concrete foundation of what you did when the doors were locked. Phase 4 unleashes the deepest level of bitterness because it introduces interpersonal trauma. You are betrayed, abandoned, or entirely forgotten by someone exactly when you needed them most. Navigating relational wounds is infinitely harder than overcoming environmental hardships. Let's return to Joseph. After flawlessly managing the prison population and accurately decoding the dreams of Pharaoh's baker and cupbearer, he made a single, desperate request. "When you get your life back, please mention my name." The cupbearer was pardoned, strutted out of the cell back into luxury, and completely wiped Joseph from his memory for 2 entire years. Let that sink in. After enduring the treacherous pit, the chains of slavery, the sting of false rape allegations, and the rot of the dungeon, the sole individual possessing the influence to break him out simply suffered convenient amnesia. Only when Pharaoh began hallucinating did the cupbearer's memory jog, placing Joseph in front of the throne within hours. Pay close attention here. Had that cupbearer remembered Joseph immediately, the Hebrew would have been released simply as a talented enslaved psychic. He would have been a fleeting curiosity in the Egyptian court. But because of the agonizing delay, because of the exact abandonment that felt like a death sentence, Joseph bypassed minor freedom and emerged as the undisputed prime minister of the empire. The cupbearer's failure wasn't a glitch in the matrix, it was a divine mechanism. God leveraged human unreliability to catapult Joseph into a stratosphere he could never have accessed otherwise. Examine the deep relational scars in your own timeline. The partner who abandoned the trenches, the colleague who stole your intellectual property, the closest ally who vanished during your darkest hour, the spiritual leader who shattered your trust. I will never justify their toxic behavior. It was wrong. However, I am boldly suggesting that the Creator harnessed their terrible decisions to forge an outcome you could never have achieved in a healthy environment. Consider Paul and Barnabas. Their conflict was so violently intense that the biblical record labels it a sharp disagreement, forcing them to split. The result? The missionary footprint instantly doubled. God does not author human malice, but He is terrifyingly sovereign enough to weaponize it for your ultimate good. The most lethal trap in this phase is the resentment you harbor toward the person who broke you. That bitterness is likely the exact barrier holding back your promotion. It isn't about letting them off the hook, it's about realizing that unforgiveness is a jail cell where you hold the only key. The Creator cannot hand immense authority to someone still clutching a bloody grudge. Joseph's ultimate crowning occurred the moment he stared into the eyes of the brothers who sold him into slavery and declared, "You didn't send me here, God did." That wasn't a trauma response or toxic positivity. That was the elite theology of a man who survived the worst of humanity and emerged deeply convinced that the Almighty micromanages every detail, especially the agonizing ones. Can you look at your betrayer and say the same? Phase 5 introduces the final grueling exam right on the threshold of your breakthrough, and it almost always masquerades as total, devastating defeat. This is the precise mile marker where the vast majority of people tap out. Having survived the stripping, the obscure faithfulness, the agonizing betrayals, and the endless waiting, they finally see daylight. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, an obstacle drops that makes it appear as though the vault is permanently slamming shut, and they walk away mere inches from the gold. Picture Moses standing before the roaring Red Sea. The Israelites have miraculously escaped, the Egyptian tyrant surrendered. They are tasting freedom. Suddenly, Pharaoh reverses his decree. The world's most lethal military force charges them from behind, and an impassable ocean blocks their front. Human logic dictates it is a catastrophic checkmate. It looks entirely as though returning to bondage was their only true destiny. Yet, in that exact moment of perceived annihilation, God commands Moses to simply lift his piece of wood. Think of the prophet Elijah at the summit of Mount Carmel. He just incinerated the altar with heavenly fire and slaughtered 450 pagan priests in arguably the most epic spiritual victory in ancient history. The very next day, Queen Jezebel issues a 24-hour death warrant on his head. Elijah completely shatters. He sprints into the wilderness, collapses beneath a scrub brush, and literally begs the Creator to take his life, weeping that he is finished right after his greatest career triumph. This final exam always looks like failure. It arrives as screaming evidence that you hallucinated the entire calling, that your faith was a joke, and that the game is over. The singular question being tested is this: will you surrender to the optical illusion of your circumstances, or will you stand on what the Almighty actually promised? After Samuel poured the oil of kingship over David, the young warrior didn't get a throne, he got a target on his back. At his lowest, he was hiding in the cave of Adullam, commanding a pathetic militia of 400 outcasts who were bankrupt, heavily distressed, and deeply bitter. That was his royal court, just a dark rock and an army of misfits. Yet in that damp darkness, David continued composing worship songs. He relentlessly pursued the Creator. When handed two perfect stealthy opportunities to assassinate the mad King Saul and accelerate his own coronation, he dropped his weapon, refusing to murder the Lord's anointed. He aced the final exam. He flat out refused to kick the door open before God turned the handle. You are likely facing a parallel test right now. You played by the rules. You did the grunt work in the shadows. You pardoned your backstabbers. You endured the agonizing silence. And now, out of nowhere, a massive setback hits. Funding collapses. A vital connection ghosts you. The promised promotion goes to someone else. The Creator is asking you the exact same question He has been asking since day one. Do you actually trust me? Not when the math makes perfect sense, not when the trajectory is clearly pointing up, but right here in the dark, when everything looks entirely backwards. Do you trust my steering wheel? This is the exact crucible where theoretical faith transforms into blood and sweat faith. It is faith that costs you something. Faith that marches forward into a brick wall. And historically, it is the absolute final hurdle before the heavens break open. Zoom out and observe the breathtaking architecture of this divine process. The Creator injects a prophetic vision of your future to pull you forward. He violently strips away your ego and self-reliance to ensure you lean solely on Him. He heavily audits your integrity in the most boring, unmonitored corners of your life. He permits trusted allies to cause you deep wounds, cultivating a bulletproof reliance on heavenly provision rather than human promises. Finally, He drops a terrifying illusion of defeat right on the finish line to test your ultimate surrender. Then, and strictly then, does He elevate. Recognize the singular thread sewing this entire sequence together. The systematic construction of the only material strong enough to survive immense blessing. A character anchored entirely in the divine rather than itself. The mature Joseph, who manages the global Egyptian food crisis, is completely unrecognizable from the arrogant 17-year-old who bragged about his dreams. He is a seasoned warrior who hit rock bottom and found God waiting there. He bled for his integrity, issued pardons to his abusers, and learned to trust an invisible God over terrifying visible realities. That specific version of Joseph could safely wield the power of Egypt. The teenage version would have burned it to the ground. The exact same metamorphosis applies to you. The individual who eventually crosses the threshold into the promise will bear zero resemblance to the person who initially started the hike. You will be custom forged for the heavyweight assignment awaiting you. But hear this critical warning before we conclude. This sequence is not a magical formula, guaranteeing God will elevate you according to your own personal vision board. His blueprint for your greatness might clash violently with your own. For Joseph, it was political supremacy to halt a famine. For Moses, it was the explosive liberation of a slave race. For David, it was establishing a military superpower. But for John the Baptist, elevation meant the brief honor of pointing at the Messiah before having his head severed in a dungeon. For the Apostle Paul, promotion meant becoming the most prolific author of the New Testament while rotting in chains, battling a physical agony he begged God to remove 3 separate times only to be told no. Divine elevation is rarely comfortable, it is frequently invisible to the masses. It almost never aligns with your original sketches. But it is always undeniably purpose. It is the flawless synchronization of who you were engineered to be with what you were deployed to execute. Therefore, loosen your death grip on how you think the story must end. Grip fiercely onto the creator's flawless track record and grant him the creative license to build what he wants. If you are currently agonizing inside this grinder, if you're being stripped, if you're sweating in obscurity, or if you're still bleeding from a betrayal, burn this truth into your mind. The sheer difficulty of your path is not proof of God's absence. It is the ultimate proof of his deep involvement. The most powerful weapons in the biblical arsenal were never handed in easy training camp. They were the soldiers who flatly refused to retreat when the environment turned lethal. Deuteronomy 8:2 reveals that the Almighty dragged Israel through the barren wastes specifically to break their pride, to audit their souls, and to expose their true allegiances. He was not acting as a sadist, he was running a diagnostic test to see if they could handle the promised land. He is executing that exact same diagnostic on you today. The book of James commands us to let the grinding pressure of trials finish its work so that we may become fully mature, lacking absolutely nothing. Becoming a person who lacks nothing is the grand prize. The goal isn't just a fatter paycheck or a corner office. The goal is forging an unbreakable soul that has walked through the inferno and emerged fireproof. Look at your current phase in this sequence and stop begging the Creator to shortcut the process. Start asking Him what tool He is currently using to shape you, because the final masterpiece is worth every ounce of the pain. On the morning Joseph finally became the second most powerful human on earth, he did not wake up to angelic trumpets. He woke up as a forgotten convict on a filthy floor identical to the thousands of mornings before it. Then a guard shouted his name. He was summoned by Pharaoh. He hastily shaved, swapped his rags for clean linen, and marched into the throne room. Before the sun dipped below the horizon, he was dripping in gold chains, wearing the royal signet ring and commanding the empire from a sovereign chariot. Nothing about his breakfast indicated it was the day his universe would flip, but it was. You have no idea what chapter you are currently surviving. You have no concept of how close you are to the page turn that changes everything. But you possess the exact formula required to survive the wait. Make the identical choices Joseph made in the dirt, in the mansion, and in the cell. Maintain your integrity. Refuse to surrender your faith. Keep your vision locked vertically. The door that miraculously swung open for him is waiting to open for the version of you currently being built to walk through it. Let the architect finish his work.